I never thought a simple sleepover could turn into a nightmare. When Lily, Marcus, and Jenna invited me to their parents' empty house for the weekend, I expected popcorn, movies, and late-night laughter. I didn't expect the shadows to watch us. I didn't expect the whispers in the dark. And I certainly didn't expect the figure that moved just beyond the edge of our sight, learning our names, waiting for the right moment to strike. That night, nothing would be the same again. I never thought a simple sleepover could turn into something so wrong. It began like any other Friday night. I arrived at Emma's house just as the sun was dipping behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Her house was the kind that looked cozy from the outside, 2 stories with warm lights glowing through the windows, but as I stepped onto the porch, a chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was just excitement. Maybe it was. Inside, the smell of cinnamon and cleaning products hit me first. Emma and the others were already sprawled across the living room, blankets and pillows piled high. We laughed, teasing one another as we set up snacks and our laptops for movies. I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, but every time I glanced at the corners of the room, the shadows seemed sharper, darker. The floorboards creaked under our movements, groaning like the house itself was alive. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. As the night went on, we told stories, joked about school, and dared each other to do silly things. I felt the tension in the room ease as laughter filled the space, but every now and then, my eyes caught movement out of the corner of my vision, a flicker of shadow that vanished before I could focus on it. My stomach twisted, a pit of unease I couldn't shake. Eventually, the dares began. At first, they were harmless. Run to the kitchen in your pajamas, eat a spoonful of hot sauce, dance around the room. But then Emma dared me to go upstairs alone, just for a moment, to grab her old photo album from her bedroom. My heart thumped in my chest, and I hesitated, but she insisted with a grin. The other girls whispered encouragement, but even their voices sounded strange, distant, like they were far away. The stairs groaned under my weight as I ascended. Each step echoed through the house, and I felt my pulse quicken. When I reached her bedroom, the door was slightly ajar. I knew we had left it closed, but I shrugged, telling myself I had imagined it. The air in the room was colder than the living room, carrying a metallic tang I couldn't place. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the photo album from the shelf. At first, it was comforting. Pictures of school events, birthdays, and past sleepovers smiled back at me, frozen in time. But then I noticed something that made my chest tighten. In the last photo, taken just a week ago, a dark, blurry figure stood behind us, tall, featureless, impossible to ignore. I blinked, thinking it was a shadow or a trick of the light, but my heart wouldn't stop hammering. I closed the album, ready to go back downstairs. And that's when I saw it. On the inside of the bedroom door was a handprint, smeared as though someone had tried to push the door open from the other side. I knew no one had been in the room. I froze, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. Then I heard it, a faint creak outside the door, a sound too deliberate to be the house settling. I froze, clutching the photo album, my breath catching in my throat. My legs felt heavy, refusing to move. Slowly, I slid the door open, careful not to make a sound. Nothing. The hallway was empty. My heart pounded so loudly it felt like it would burst from my chest. I bolted back downstairs, forcing a laugh as I rejoined the others. I wanted to act normal, to convince myself I was imagining things. But even as I settled back on the blanket, a cold sensation brushed my arm. A fingertip. Light and wet, sending shivers racing down my spine. I whipped my head around, but no one was there. The rest of the night passed in a blur. We watched movies, laughed nervously, and tried to ignore the creeping unease. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak a warning. I tried to close my eyes, hoping sleep would come, but I kept seeing it. Figures lurking at the edges of the room, taller and darker than they should have been. My mind refused to rest. Just before I finally drifted off, a whisper of movement came from the corner of the room. Something shifted in the darkness, slow and deliberate. And then, almost impossibly close, I felt it again. The touch of icy fingers grazing my arm. My eyes snapped open, but the darkness had swallowed everything. I wasn't alone, and I knew in that moment that the night had only just begun. I woke up to silence. The living room was dark, the only light coming from a thin sliver of moon that had slipped through the curtains. My heart was still hammering from the night before, my arm tingling where I had felt that icy touch. For a moment I thought I had imagined it all, that maybe my mind had played tricks on me. But when I glanced at the blankets, I noticed they had been shifted during the night, as though someone, or something, had been moving among us while we slept. Emma and the others seemed to be asleep, their soft breathing the only sound in the room. I stared at them for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. The shadows in the corners of the room, however, refused to lie. They stretched unnaturally, flickering as if they were alive. I shivered, wishing the sun would come up already. Hesitant, I slipped off the blanket and decided to get some water from the kitchen. Each step I took made the floorboards groan, echoing through the house. The air felt heavier here, thicker, like it was pressing against my skin. My reflection in the kitchen window made me jump. At first, I thought it was just me, hair sticking up and eyes wide. But then I noticed the shadow behind me, a flicker of movement that vanished the moment I blinked. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, or my imagination running wild after a night of bad dreams. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave. Every glance toward the hall made my stomach tighten. Every creak of the old house set my nerves on edge. I returned to the living room, trying to appear calm, though my hands were shaking. That's when I saw it. On the floor, arranged in a crude circle, were several of our photo frames, all turned face down. Each one had belonged in Emma's bedroom, yet here they were, on the living room floor. My pulse quickened as I knelt to pick them up, noticing the faintest residue beneath one frame, a dark smudge, sticky and cold to the touch. And then I saw the writing. It was faint, smeared in a way that made it almost invisible unless you were close. "You are next." My fingers trembled as I traced the words, trying to tell myself someone was playing a prank. But the letters were not written in pencil or ink. They were carved lightly into the wood, the edges cold under my touch. I jerked my hands away and glanced at Emma. She stirred, her eyes half open, bleary and confused. I pointed to the words on the floor, my voice barely a whisper. She stared at it, blinked, and forced a laugh. "It's probably just someone messing with us," she said, but her voice wavered. I could see the fear hidden behind her words. We decided to barricade ourselves in the living room. Piling blankets and pillows in front of the door, we huddled together, hearts racing. The house seemed to hum around us, the silence heavier, more oppressive than before. Every creak of the floor, every groan of the walls made my stomach twist. Then I heard it. Footsteps upstairs, slow, deliberate, and dragging. I froze, clutching Emma's arm, trying to convince myself it was one of us moving. But it wasn't. The sound circled above, passing over rooms we had just walked through, closer and closer to the staircase. I couldn't see anything, but I felt its presence, massive and patient, waiting for the right moment. I held my breath as the shadow moved across the staircase, and in the faint light, I saw it. A tall, dark figure, faceless, towering, and impossibly thin. It didn't move like a person. It glided, floating over the steps without making the slightest noise. My chest tightened, and my stomach lurched as it paused at the top of the stairs as if studying us. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but the blankets at the door were the only barrier between us and whatever it was. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. The hallway upstairs was empty, silent. We huddled together, trembling, not daring to move. I kept my eyes on the staircase, half expecting it to reappear at any moment. The words from the floor haunted me. "You are next." Whoever or whatever was in the house knew we were awake, knew we were afraid. And deep down, I understood that this night wasn't over, not by a long shot. The air grew colder, heavier, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the shadows around us were moving closer, creeping along the walls, stretching across the floor, waiting. And as I glanced at Emma, her face pale and eyes wide with terror, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the edge of the living room, just where the shadows pooled thickest, a single handprint appeared, pressed into the floor as if someone, or something, had just stepped through the darkness. It wasn't ours. By dawn, none of us had slept. The air in the living room was thick with fear, a weight pressing down on my chest that made it hard to breathe. Emma and the others sat huddled together, wrapped in blankets, whispering nervously, though I couldn't catch what they were saying. Every shadow in the room seemed to shift when I blinked, stretching toward us like dark fingers reaching for something to grab. I tried to convince myself it was all imagination, that the night had just been too long and our minds were playing tricks. But then I glanced at Emma's photo album lying open on the coffee table, and my stomach dropped. The last photo, the one with the shadowy figure standing behind us, had changed. Or maybe I hadn't seen it clearly before. This time, the figure looked closer, taller, sharper somehow, as though it had moved into our world while we slept. I felt my throat tighten. Determined to find some rational explanation, I decided to check the other rooms. Quietly, I slipped out of the living room, my bare feet brushing against the cold floor. The hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, the walls narrowing as the shadows pressed closer. Every door I passed was closed, but some seemed to breathe, expanding slightly as if inhaling, then returning to normal. I shook my head, trying to ignore the rising panic. When I reached the guest bathroom, I froze. The mirrors reflected the room, but something was wrong. Shapes moved in the reflections that weren't in the room. Shadows lingered in corners where there were no corners. Figures peered at me from behind glass with no bodies attached to them. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a towel rack, and my reflection looked wrong, too. Eyes darker, more hollow than they should have been. I blinked, and the images vanished. I wanted to run back to the safety of the others, but when I tried the front door, it wouldn't budge. I pulled, twisted, slammed my shoulder against it, but it remained locked, unmoving. Panic climbed my throat, a living thing, sharp and biting. I turned toward the basement door, my last hope for an exit. It seemed to beckon me, dark and yawning, the smell of damp and decay spilling out. I grabbed a flashlight and descended slowly, each step groaning under my weight. Halfway down, I saw them, scratches on the walls, jagged and deep. At first, I thought they were from the old house settling, but as I squinted, I realized the scratches were names. Our names. My name, Emma's, and the others. The wood was fresh, the edges still sharp. My fingers trembled as I traced one, the splinters cutting into my skin. Then I saw the eyes. Two small, glowing points in the far corner, staring at me with a patience that made my blood run cold. I couldn't see a face, just the eyes, unblinking and cruel. My knees buckled. I wanted to run, but the flashlight flickered, throwing the basement into deeper darkness. When it came back on, the eyes were gone. My chest heaved, and I stumbled back upstairs, desperate to escape. But the living room, it wasn't how I left it. The blankets we had piled to barricade the door were shredded, torn as if someone had ripped through them while we weren't looking. And sitting in the center of the wreckage was a photo frame, face up. I froze, my mind screaming not to look, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The photo inside made me want to scream. It was us, all of us. But our faces were wrong, twisted, pale, eyes black and hollow. Behind us, the shadowy figure loomed, taller and darker than I had ever seen it, its form solid now, pressing against the edges of the photograph like it belonged there. My hands shook as I dropped the frame, unable to comprehend how something in a picture could feel so alive, so close. I backed away, heart racing, and that's when I heard it. A slow, deliberate movement just outside the living room. Footsteps circling the room, dragging softly across the floor. A whisper almost imperceptible. "You can't hide anymore." My stomach twisted and I pressed myself against the wall, trying to make myself invisible. The shadows seemed to grow thicker, pooling into dark shapes that clung to the corners of the room. I could feel them watching, waiting, moving closer with every heartbeat. And then the flashlight flickered again, and when it came back on, I realized with a sinking horror that the circle of shredded blankets had a new addition, another handprint, wet and cold, leading toward the basement. I knew then that the figure wasn't done, not by a long shot. It was learning, watching, marking us. And I understood, with a dread so sharp it cut through me, that this night wasn't just a nightmare we could wake from. Whatever was in the house was patient. It was hungry, and it had chosen us. By evening, the house had become a trap. Every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed alive, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like a warning. Emma and the others huddled together, speaking in whispers too low for me to hear. None of us dared to move far from the living room, yet even here, safety felt impossible. The air was thick with fear, a suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest and made my stomach twist with anxiety. I tried to keep my mind focused, convincing myself that there must be some explanation. But the more I looked around, the stranger everything became. Shadows stretched across the walls, shifting unnaturally, pooling in corners where the light should have reached. Objects moved slightly when I wasn't looking. Pillow edges shifted, blankets slid, and a photo frame tilted on the coffee table as if nudged by unseen fingers. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowy figure looming over us. Its presence was constant, patient, like it was waiting for the exact moment we let our guard down. My heart hammered in my chest, every beat louder than the last, and I felt my fear feeding it, giving it life. Then came the scratching. At first it was soft, almost polite, like someone tracing their fingernails along the walls. But it grew louder, more frantic, as if something, or someone, was clawing its way toward us. Emma whispered that she could hear it too, and the others nodded, wide-eyed and pale. We barricaded ourselves in the kitchen this time, shoving chairs and stools against the doors. I tried to hold my breath, waiting for the sound to stop, but it didn't. The scratching continued, circling the room, growing closer and faster. And then the lights went out. Total darkness. My stomach dropped, and a cold sweat ran down my back. I fumbled for my phone, but the flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The shadows clung to the walls, moving like liquid, twisting and stretching as if alive. And then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling us in the kitchen. They were impossible to locate, coming from all directions at once. A low, guttural whisper followed, so close I could feel it brushing against my ear. "Why are you hiding? We're already inside." My blood ran cold. Inside? Inside what? The house? My mind? My body? I couldn't tell. I froze, too terrified to move. The whisper repeated, softer this time, almost teasing, almost patient. I forced my shaking hands to hold the flashlight steady, sweeping it across the room. Nothing. The shadows pooled thicker than ever, a mass of darkness that seemed to breathe. And then I saw it. Or rather, I saw what it left behind. On the wall, etched in condensation from the evening chill, words appeared, wet and glistening in the faint light. "Look behind you!" My stomach lurched, my pulse leaping into my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, to close my eyes, but I couldn't move. Slowly my head turned. The kitchen was empty. The shadows swirled, but no one stood there. The others, huddled in the corner, were wide-eyed and frozen, and then I noticed something even worse. On the floor, in the center of the kitchen, a new circle had been scratched into the wood, deep and jagged. In the center of the circle, letters were carved in a hand so dark it looked burned into the wood. My name. I stumbled back, my mind refusing to process it. How could it know my name? The whispers returned, faint but insistent, like the wind through a cracked window. We know. We see. We wait. The shadows shifted again, and in that movement, I thought I saw the shape of something tall, impossibly thin, leaning over the circle on the floor. Emma's voice barely reached my ears, a quivering whisper, and I realized with a jolt that she had been speaking to no one. Her eyes were fixed on the same spot I was, filled with a terror that mirrored my own. And then I understood. The figure had been closer than we realized, standing just beyond the edge of our perception, patient, invisible, waiting. We couldn't leave. The doors wouldn't open. The windows, even if we tried, were too high or barred. And the shadows, they weren't just on the walls anymore. They had begun to creep closer to us, reaching, stretching, moving with intent. The whispers grew louder, echoing in my mind, pressing against my thoughts, until I realized I couldn't even remember if my own voice was my own. And then, the air grew colder, unbearably so, pressing in on my skin. I could feel it. Something brushing past me, just out of sight, closer than I dared imagine. My name was whispered again, low, patient, and unmistakable. You can't hide. I backed against the counter, staring at the floor, at the new circle with my name, at the impossibly dark corners where the shadows pooled. And then I saw it. A faint pair of glowing eyes just at the edge of the kitchen, unblinking, waiting. It was patient, and I knew in that moment that it wouldn't stop. Not tonight. Not ever. I don't know how long I ran. Hallways twisted into themselves, rooms led nowhere, and every door I opened returned me to the same living room, as if the house itself had swallowed me whole. My heart pounded like a drum in my chest, my lungs burned, and every instinct screamed to escape. But escape was impossible. The shadows were everywhere now, thick and alive, crawling along the walls, pooling across the floor, stretching toward me with every step I took. I stumbled over the photo album from Emma's room, its pages open to the last photograph. My chest tightened when I realized it wasn't our old pictures anymore. Each page showed me, alone, twisted in fear, my face pale, eyes hollow and black. Behind me, the shadowy figure loomed, closer with every page, pressing forward like it was stepping out of the album itself. My fingers shook as I slammed it shut, my nails digging into the edges, but the sense of being watched only grew stronger. The whispers returned, echoing from every corner of the house, low and guttural, calling my name, repeating it like a curse. I couldn't tell which direction they were coming from. Upstairs, downstairs, behind walls I hadn't noticed before. They were all around me, filling the space, filling my mind. The air grew thick, heavy and cold, and I realized I was gasping for breath as if the shadows themselves were pressing against my chest. I reached the front door, desperate for escape, and it swung open easily. I bolted outside into the dim morning light, expecting freedom, expecting the warm sun to chase away the terror. But the world outside looked wrong. The sky was pale and still, the trees frozen in unnatural shapes. And in the distance, the house loomed, its windows dark, its walls pulsing almost imperceptibly, like a heartbeat I could feel from across the yard. I glanced around frantically for the others. Emma, Lily, Marcus, anyone. But the yard was empty. Panic surged again, stronger this time, twisting my stomach into knots. And then I saw them. Our faces, staring back at me from every window, but it wasn't the real us. Their expressions were contorted, eyes hollow, mouths frozen in silent screams. Behind each figure, the shadow loomed taller, darker, impossibly solid. I stumbled backward, tripping over the uneven ground. My mind scrambled, trying to understand what was happening. The shadows weren't confined to the house. They were spilling out, creeping along the walls, slipping into the air around me, pressing closer with every heartbeat. And then I realized the worst thing. The shadows weren't just behind the windows. They were in me. A cold rush ran through my chest, spreading to my fingers, to my toes. I felt the same icy touch from the first night, the same brush of wet, cold fingertips, but this time it wasn't brief. It clung to me, curling around my limbs, moving inside my mind. I screamed, but no sound came out. My voice had been stolen. I wanted to run, to escape, but my legs refused to obey. I stumbled forward, dragging one foot after another, as if the house itself had tethered me to its darkness. Every step closer to the road felt like walking deeper into a nightmare. The shadows moved faster now, circling me, pressing against my skin, whispering my name, twisting it into words I didn't recognize. Then I noticed it. The photo album lying open in the grass beside the path leading from the house. The pages were blank, except for the last one. My own face stared up at me, twisted in terror, and behind me, the shadow stretched its impossibly long arms, reaching toward me as if to pull me back inside. I wanted to tear my eyes away, but I couldn't. My reflection in the glassy photo seemed alive, watching me, breathing with me, screaming silently. I ran blindly, heart hammering, until I could run no more. My legs gave out, and I collapsed on the cold ground. The house loomed behind me, silent now, yet alive. The whispers faded, leaving only a low, patient hum that thrummed through my bones. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, not in front, not behind, but inside me. I scrambled to my feet, tears streaming down my face, knowing there was no escape. And that's when I saw them, my friends, or at least what had been my friends. Their hollow eyes stared at me from the shadows behind the trees, mouths moving silently, whispering in voices that weren't theirs. And the shadow was still behind them, taller, darker, waiting, patient. I realized then, with a horror that split my mind, that the sleepover had never ended. It was never supposed to. The figure, the shadows, the house, it had chosen us, and now it had chosen me. The fear, the darkness, the whispers, they weren't just in the house. They were inside me. And someday, someone else will arrive at that house, and it will be waiting for them too. I ran into the morning light, but I know now I will never escape. The sleepover never ended.